Better? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so we thought, normally it's a 5-year plan that we prepare for both. Um, but given the amount of work that's going on across city staff right now, we thought we'd present just the 2026 year for both plans, and then next year we would come back with a full plan again, 5 years. So you can see the agenda here. We're just going to touch on that 2026 CIP, and then we're going to get into the fiscal plan, kind of the background to it, core assumptions in it. We'll review it. And then we're actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about some other funds of interest. So not necessarily the fiscal plan, but we thought if we're going to just do the 2026 version of it, it's a good opportunity to maybe fill a little bit of time talking about some of our other major funds as well. And then we'll get into asking you for direction on policy questions related to fiscal strategy. And then, of course, next steps. So getting into the capital improvement plan, it's a almost $19.2 million plan for 2026. You can see on the right-hand side what some of the largest highlights in the plan are. So facilities takes up the largest portion of the plan. Most of that $9.5 million of it is for the fire station. $500,000 was already budgeted previously for the design portion, so then this is strictly construction. For utilities, that includes things like the Highview infrastructure project that's electric related, Lameti interceptor design, that's sewer, slip lining is also sewer, and then ongoing advanced metering infrastructure installations for the water utility. Obviously, those total up to quite a bit less than almost $3 million you have there, and that's because so much of our capital projects for utilities involve things like capital qualifying inventory and things that we need to purchase to be ready for development as it occurs. So not a lot of large one-time projects in the utilities, just a lot of that ongoing recurring capital acquisitions for inventory and such. And then we have things like the Kinney Corridor implementation, Locust Street extension, which I'll spend a little bit of time talking about. The library has $2.3 million budgeted for a variety of foundation capital campaign related projects. Then we have Paulson Road streetlights, which is TID finance or tax increment district financed. Fiber network extension to the police department just to add some resiliency in the fiber network. That's an IT project. Patrol vehicle replacements for fleet, and then a taxi van replacement. So those are the large one-time projects that are in the capital improvement plan. So getting into funding sources then, the largest portion here is levy-backed borrowing. The note here is that we may proceed with a larger borrowing that includes the construction portion of that Lameti Phase 1 project. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the fiscal plan discussion and why we would do that. In that case, it would actually be general obligation borrowing, but it would be revenue-backed rather than levy-backed. And then utility cash financing represents about $3.3 million, grants and donations onto fund balance, which the majority of that is for the fire station. As you recall, we had planned to do about $1.6 million in cash financing for the fire station. We'll talk about fund balance strategy as part of the fiscal plan. And then you can see that other category, about $527,000. I did just want to call out that includes things like developer contributions that would specifically relate to the Locust Street extension, insurance proceeds, and then the taxi fund. So I wanted to call out a few projects that they're larger, but aren't necessarily some of the things we've talked about, like Kinney Corridor or fire station. So the Locust Street extension, that is an extension of the street from Grove Street west to Apollo Road, which would include a sidewalk extension from Grove Street to Winter Street. That, basically the benefit there is it improves connectivity for the Oak Hill subdivision. It provides a more efficient route to the treatment facility that pulls it off some of the residential roads that some of that traffic currently has to use. And it also provides electric upgrades for the facility and locations on the west side of the community. So there's not only developer contribution funding involved here, but because there are benefits to both the sewer utility, the wastewater treatment plant, and the electric utility by creating some redundancy in the system, we are using some utility financing for this project as well. And you can see that it totals about $950,000. Phase one of the Highview Electric Improvements Project, that is extending underground cable from the hospital to the underground pedestrian tunnel under Division Street. That would be phase one of the project, and then phase two, which would come in a future year, would be taking it from the tunnel out to Liberty Road. And so this specific portion of the project represents about 3,000 feet of cable, or $400,000. And the goal here is just to build resiliency in the electric system. So then the Paulson Road streetlight replacement, which I'd mentioned earlier, is a tax increment district cost of about $257,000 to be TID number 13. And this is replacing streetlights on Paulson Road, roughly from Riverside Drive on up to Whitetail Boulevard. We've identified a number of aging streetlights along that kind of corridor there. So replacing those, just enhances essentially traffic safety, pedestrian safety, things like that. And then the Lametti project, this would be design only in 2026, about almost $222,000. The project in total will replace approximately 2,000 feet of 12 to 18-inch clay sewer main, and it would be replaced with 24-inch PVC sewer main. I think one of our city engineers, Chris Buncher, gave a presentation to the council earlier this year about this project. And this is a continuation of the North Interceptor project. You can see the full length of what that will eventually include. So we would go from design straight into construction, and then there would actually be a phase two portion of this project to go the full length of what you see here. Some projects of council interest not included in the CIP. Some of these would have been in the list last time we had talked about this. The Hoffman Park Master Plan implementation is not in the 2026 portion of the capital improvement plan. That would include parking lots, new pavilion, certain softball field improvements. There was some lighting improvements that were made out there to one of the fields, but the rest of that is not contemplated for 2026. The Public Works building expansion or renovation, which would include design and construction, are not in the 2026 CIP. That project's also not currently included in some of the longer range forecasts that we have for the CIP also, like the 5-year plan. Additional dog parks and a new regional park, I know, is something that we've discussed before, but that is not included in the 2026 CIP. So that actually concludes the portion of the CIP. Since again, it's 2026 only, it's kind of an abbreviated look at what we have coming up this next year, but that gives you a sense of the large projects that are in there. So I do want to pivot into the fiscal plan discussion then. So just as a reminder for everybody, when we talk about the fiscal plan, what is it? Well, it's a blueprint for future decisions for both capital and operating budgets. It's an opportunity for staff to receive feedback from the city council on local revenues that we do have control over, such as property tax levy, and then how we allocate that levy across the various functions of the city that are backed by property tax dollars and revenues, and also city fees. We do discuss non-local revenues and the impacts that those may have to the plan that we don't necessarily have control over, such as state shared revenue, other intergovernmental revenues, and any legislative changes that we may be aware of impacting those. We estimate future operating costs, so this is a chance for us to talk to you about what we're assuming for future expenses, primarily in the general fund, since that's the fund we're primarily talking about with fiscal plan. And then it's a chance for us to talk to you about what we're estimating future debt commitments to be. So just very briefly, the first fiscal plan is the 2011 to 2015 fiscal plan, and identified several topics such as confirming financial policies such as fund balance, minimum fund balance rather, and then debt levels, maintaining adequate reserves, maintaining or improving debt metrics, total debt obligation, things like that. And then it talks about various revenue concerns like shared revenues, transportation aids, payment in lieu of tax impacts from, at the time, what was the power plant decommissioning. And as we get into core assumptions of the fiscal plan and some of the other discussions, you'll see that some of those things are still topics of conversation, things we're keeping an eye on. So assumptions that we've baked into the fiscal plan for now, for 2026, that we'd like to confirm with you, that, it's the direction you'd still like to see us going, is that we still assume, that you do not want to increase the net tax levy by more than 4%. So what that's saying is we set essentially the tax levy that's needed for the following year's budgeted operations. And then there is based on growth that occurs in the community, that tax levy is not all then essentially the burden of existing properties. Because of growth that happens, you can actually reduce the tax burden for existing properties. And that's what we're talking about with net tax levy. So it's the tax increase net of growth. And our understanding from the council is that you do not want that to exceed 4%. For fund balance, it's a minimum target of 40%. It'd be a minimum of 40% with a target of 50% of budgeted expenses. So whatever we're budgeting in the general fund for the upcoming year's expenses, we understand that you want us to have no less than 40% of unassigned fund balance available to meet emergency needs, strategic opportunities, but then our target is 50. For total general obligation indebtedness, the state actually has a statute that says you cannot have more than 5% of the value of your community as measured by equalized value, since that's what the state uses. Your total general obligation indebtedness cannot exceed 5% of that equalized value. And then the city council set a goal to be half of that, or 2.5% of equalized value in terms of total general obligation indebtedness. And when we model our fiscal plan out, we don't assume that you would want to deviate from that. So that's the limit that we're imposing on our plans as we model out into future years. For expenses, we're currently assuming a 2% wage increase and benefits of 6%. Some years that's enough. Some years it's not. On this particular council agenda, I believe you're considering the health insurance renewal, and it is not. It's well below 6% in this case. And so that's what we use for benefits when modeling. And then other operating costs, we assume 2%. With revenues, we're not assuming any major changes except for the tax levy that you as the council are setting locally. There are certain shared revenues, such as the Act 12, I believe it was. I lose track of the acts sometimes, but I believe it was Act 12 that increased shared revenues based on state sales tax receipts. So when we know that some of those things are happening, we do go ahead and bake those into the model. The state gives you a heads up about this time of the year, saying, you can go ahead and assume X% increase to that shared revenue amount. For 2026, it was about $10,000 to $15,000 more than what we had budgeted previously. It's about $550,000 now. Certain transfers between funds are also some adjustments that we may be making, and I will get into a little bit of that more. So that's kind of the backstory, the assumptions that we're using when we're modeling the fiscal plan. And now getting into what's being proposed for 2026 and how that compares to where we thought we would be when we put together the 2024 to 2028 fiscal plan. We had budgeted or assumed we would be budgeting about almost $13.8 million by now. The proposed budget for 2026 that you'll be seeing later on this year is actually about $13.5 million. Now that excludes the one-time transfer because we're using fund balance cash financing for the fire station. That figures operations only, so that excludes that one-time transfer of cash to our capital fund for the fire station project. When you factor that in, and it's $897,500, it does include some funding for, I believe, one of our ComDev related plans. So it's $800,000 for the fire station, then $97,500 in some smaller cash financing in the CIP. That actually gets you to a total of $14.4 million, which is $651,000 more than we thought where we'd be. But again, if you back out that one-time transfer for fire station expenses, it's actually lower by over $200,000 compared to where we thought we would actually be for operating expenses in the general fund. And you can see how that shakes out in the detail. So the majority of that is personnel related with turnover and retirements and things like that. You typically will end up experiencing some lower personnel related costs. There's also some allocation of personnel costs out to other funds that we're trying to do now. So whereas before, you may recall, we would budget essentially everything in the general fund and then have other funds transferring money into the general fund as a reflection of the services being rendered to those funds by kind of administrative employees or general fund funded employees. We've now moved to a model of just direct allocation. We weren't doing that when this fiscal plan was developed, so that also plays a role in the large difference you're seeing here. Operating costs are higher. We were frankly a little lean at the time when we were modeling out our non-personnel operating costs, given the inflationary environment that we've been in. So you're seeing quite a bit of a change there. And then really the only other change that's substantive to call out here would be that, again, that transfer out to our capital fund for the fire station to do the second part of the cash financing for that project. So then when you start getting into the levy comparison, then you can see where we thought we would be for the tax levy on the left-hand side there. Where we're proposing to be is about $91,000 less. And then the allocation between functions, there's a little bit more of the levy being allocated toward the general fund than originally contemplated. And that's a function of the fact that there's a little less being allocated to debt service and quite a bit less being allocated to capital. Now, the reason for that, as you'll see on one of the upcoming slides, is that we're in a position now where we find ourselves as a city having a very strong unassigned fund balance. And so rather than borrowing, rather than levying for some of these one-time costs in debt service, we're applying cash right now in a manner that's consistent with, again, what we understand council parameters to be for the target fund balance of 50%. And the result then is we've got a little less debt service, a little less levy needed for capital, but you will see that apportionment of taxes shift then as a result of that. But the bottom line is we're proposing to levy about $91,000 less than we originally thought we would. So now we've got the levy, and I want to talk a little bit about valuation, and then we're going to head toward that slide where we get into mill rates and estimated bills a little bit. So when the current fiscal plan, the 2024 to 2028 plan, was originally put together, we thought that we would be at a little less than $1.5 billion in assessed value. Now, as you're aware, we're going through the revaluation process to bring property values back up to what market or equalized value in state terminology would be. So given that we just did the revaluation, we're actually at an estimated assessed value of almost $1.95 billion. And as far as equalized value or market value goes, and this is a report that the state puts out every year in August, we've actually crossed the $2 billion mark. So I recall that it wasn't that long ago that we crossed the $1 billion mark, and that was a really big deal. And we've already crossed the $2 billion mark. And then we're assessing at about 95% of that with the revaluation. So what that leads you to then, and I'm getting into the weeds ever so slightly here, but I think it's important to just illustrate the math behind how we're estimating tax bills on this slide. You basically take what we know the proposed levy is, you divide that number by what the assessed value is, and it's a big number, but it's being divided by a much bigger number, and that's going to leave you with about a 9-digit figure, which is your mill rate. You take that, you multiply it by an average valued property, and then that's going to get you to your estimated city portion tax bill. That does not include the TIF portion. We still need more information from other taxing jurisdictions as they set their levies before we can calculate that portion of the tax bill. So this would be city portion only, excluding TID, and this is not broken down by county. So this is the total levy divided by total assessed value, community-wide, multiplied by an average property of about $350,000. There's your estimated city portion of the tax bill, excluding TIF, and that's down by about $48 compared to last year's version of this calculation. Now, folks' individual tax bills are going to vary. Depends on what county you're in, depends on your specific property value. The assessed value went up because of the revaluation by about 35%. So if your individual property was assessed less, either the increase due to the revaluation went up by less than 35%, it is possible that your tax bill would be lower as a result of the revaluation. If it went up by more than 35%, chances are your bill would be higher than it was last year. But kind of this amalgamated average of levy and assessed value, average property, that would be about $48 less than last year. And so that mill rate of 0.004349993, another way of thinking about that, which is actually in that table at the top, is $4.34 rounded off per $1,000 of property value. And you can see how that's being allocated out then. So of that total, about $3.26 per $1,000 of property value is going toward general fund services, 49 cents to the library, 56 cents to general obligating debt service. I want to talk about that in just a second. And then 3 cents to capital cash financing. The reason that the general obligating debt service is quite a bit lower than where we thought it would be is in part due to the revaluation, but it's also in part due to the fact that there are no borrowings proposed for this year. So there are currently no plans for the council to see, Ellers come do their presentation and talk about a borrowing this year. For the fire station, we do anticipate borrowing that money in roughly the January to February timeframe. And because of that, we would make our first principal payments on that debt service in 2027. So you'll see the levy impact from the fire station borrowing kind of come online in 2027. So you're not seeing it here. But when it comes to anticipated debt, where we thought we'd be, where we are, you can see that the fire station portion went from about $4.1 million to $7 million. I think we'd come back to you at some workshop in the past and kind of talked about the fact that the costs for the fire station project were looking to be quite a bit higher than where we thought they would be given inflation at the time and things like that. So we did upsize the planned budget for the project, and now we're contemplating a $7 million borrow. The Locust Street extension, as I'd mentioned earlier, there are some developer contributions we're able to apply to that project, and then with the utility participation, because of the enhancements we're making to the utility system and the wastewater treatment plant, as a result of that project, we won't be issuing any debt for that one, or at least we don't plan to. And then the library AC and controller project is included as part of what they're doing right now. So there's no need for any debt to be issued for that either. So what you do see is we went from about a we'll call it $4.4 million plan to borrow to 8.5 rounded. But when you look at the impact to the levy, we're going from what we thought would be about 83 cents per $1,000 to 90 cents per $1,000. And when you talk about how the council wants to allocate the tax levy, you had set a target of when we're apportioning the levy, a target of no more than 20% of the levy to debt service. We were thinking it would be about 14. Now it's at 16, or we're thinking it'll be at about 16. So we're still under that target. And the reason why you're not seeing a larger increase there, because, if we're almost doubling levy, but it's only going up about 7 cents per $1,000. The reason for that is that Lameti Interceptor project, again, we would contemplate borrowing on using general obligation debt, but we would actually be satisfying the debt service requirement for that debt with revenue, with utility dollars, essentially. So there'd be no need to levy for that. There's a couple reasons we do that, just as a refresher. I know we've talked about this in the past, but one is to the extent that our general obligation capacity allows, there's the state statutory limit I talked about, and then council set a policy to be half of that state limit. So to the extent that those capacities allow, when you issue on a general general obligation basis, you actually take advantage of lower interest rates because you're backing that debt with the entire community's tax base versus just the utility base, which both are large, but from a lender perspective, that tax base is larger, lower risk. So you do get lower rates that way. And then the second reason is because of how the state levy limit formula works. This is that when you do general obligation debt and you back it with revenue from a utility, you're able to claim that debt for levy limit purposes, and that's essentially a tool that many cities use to otherwise, that levy limit's only going up 1, 2, 3%, often not keeping pace with inflation. This is a very typical common tool that cities use. So that is a second reason why we would consider doing this. And then the fire station portion of that project, as you recall, we just executed the 2027 to 2046 agreement with the Rural Fire Association. And in that agreement, they'll be contributing about $250,000 per year specifically for the fire station project that we would use to offset what we would otherwise have to be levying for our debt service for that project. So those two pieces, the revenue-backed general obligation debt and the Rural Fire Association participation in the debt service, is why you're seeing, yep, that's quite a bit more debt, but actually the net levy impact there is not nearly as large as the numbers might suggest because of those reasons. And it's a difference of about $25 per year on an average value home. So then getting into fund balance a little bit, I'd mentioned earlier I wanted to talk about that. We're about where we thought we would be in terms of percent estimated fund balance, but you can see where we think we're heading. And this is an example of, I know we're talking 2026 only, but I wanted to use the opportunity to share with you where we think we're heading. This I would say right now for 2025, where that line is currently set, may end up being a little bit on the conservative side. As you'll see today, in your comptroller report, we're about $2 million revenue over expenses right now, which is somewhat normal for this time of year, but we're still about $700,000 ahead of where we typically are. So winter's coming. We don't know what that's going to look like. But this does appear to be a year where we're ahead of where we thought we would be in terms of operating expenses. And then we're bringing in roughly about what we thought we would be for revenues, maybe slightly higher. So looking to be so far a pretty decent year. So that line for 2025 may bump up, which would bump all the subsequent lines up as well. But based on what's kind of in the fiscal plan, kind of in that longer range capital improvement plan in terms of cash financing of projects, keep in mind the minimum for a fund balance is 40% and the target's 50, and we're above that in most of these years. So the message here is that we're approaching this year, 2026 and beyond, from a position of strength, certainly. So that's kind of the general fund fiscal plan portion. And like I mentioned, because it was an abbreviated one, I wanted to talk about some of our other major funds yet, because there are some things that you've approved over the past year or two that have an effect on some of these other funds. And I wanted to share some good news with you all. So as you recall, we adjusted electric, water, and sewer rates this year. You can see when we had last adjusted them and when we last adjusted the stormwater utility. So electric hadn't been adjusted for about 5 years, 9 years for water, and even more for sewer. And as of this year, we've got new rates in place. At the time we talked about those with you, with the Utility Advisory Board, we had noted some challenges that we were seeing in our longer range forecast for the utilities. So for the electric utility, that was more of a working capital challenge. So just as a refresher, the council policies we're working with for our utilities are we must maintain 90 days of working capital, or essentially cash on hand, 90 days of our planned expenses. And then we also seek to maintain revenue. So however much our debt service payments are going to be for the utility that year, we seek to have 1.5 times that amount in revenue coming in to those funds. So those are two policies, a debt coverage policy and then the working capital policy. So when we had come to you and talked about rates, we were primarily talking through the lenses of those two policies and challenges we were seeing at the time. So there was the working capital challenge for the electric utility, and that was primarily due to the fact that we still are, in some cases, experiencing 52-week long lead times for some of our inventory. And in order for us to be able to accommodate growth as it presents itself to us, we began essentially having more inventory on hand to meet those opportunities as they came. But then that eroded the working capital position of that utility. I think there's only one outstanding prior year debt issuance for that fund, so debt coverage really isn't the story there. It was more working capital. The opposite is the case for water and sewer. Those were both debt coverage issues related to prior year borrowings that were pretty significant for what they would typically have had. So the North Interceptor, the North Water Tower, the dryer facility, those borrowings were large. And so debt coverage was an issue there. Now, with the sewer utility, that was more of an issue of, we thought starting about this year, maybe 2026, we'd see that fund fall below the council set limit for debt coverage, or 1.5 times revenue over that year's debt service payment. For the water utility, we actually thought we were heading toward a point where we might be dipping below the bond covenant limit. So that's a lower limit. Similar to kind of the state total indebtedness thing, council set a little bit more of a conservative policy there. We have prior year debt issuances that essentially form their agreements, their contracts at the end of the day. And they have various languages in them, things we have to adhere to, one of which is debt coverage. And for the water utility, we had some prior year debt that specified we needed to maintain 1.25 times revenue to debt coverage. And when we had worked on some of our recent borrowings with Ellers, I met with Sean Lentz, as you all probably remember Sean, and we had talked about the fact that we thought we were going to be getting close on that water utility debt. So what we did there, and we actually did it for the sewer utility as well, we structured that debt so that it was some combination of interest only for a few years, or just kind of backloaded over time, to essentially buy us time to go ahead and take the debt on, proceed with the projects, and get new rate structures in place. So we did kind of actively intervene there. And the result then is what you see on this slide. So the reds are where we were already below council parameters. The yellow was kind of like the yield sign. We were below council, but we weren't quite to that bond covenant limit. You can see where I'm estimating we'll be for the end of this year, based on essentially our August balance sheet statement for those utilities, and then where we're projecting that will be in 2026. So you can see that we're heading back in a positive direction on both of those metrics for all three of the major utilities. I did want to point out for 2026 that in addition to that, that trend improving, that does also include the fact that we would be financing about $1.6 million in projects for the electric utility, $433,000 in debt service. The water utility, that projection includes the fact that we would have $637,000 in capital cash financing. And for the sewer utility, $909,000 of capital cash financing. So to sum all of that up, I would say that as a result of the actions that you took as the city council, not only have we improved on those metrics, and now we're getting back up above policy parameters there, but we're doing so while being able to accommodate large projects that we need to continue to provide good service, to accommodate growth, all of those things. So I think this is a pretty big success story here with what we did with utility rates. And then getting into some of our other large funds of interest, we don't talk about these probably very much, but I want to point them out. So our solid waste fund, that is measured. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but when you're looking at governmental funds, you're measuring fund balance. When you're looking at your proprietary funds, you're measuring cash on hand in terms of accounting standards and liquidity. So these first three funds up here are governmental funds. So we're looking at fund balance. And then the last three are proprietary funds, similar to our utilities. We're looking at cash on hand. For the solid waste fund, we were running a negative fund balance. And now at the end of 2024, we're looking at what the actual liquidity positions of these funds were. We're back into the positive, and obviously we'll continue to adjust the garbage fee and the core fee on residents' utility bills based on our contract that we currently have with waste management. And obviously that's when it comes to the fee schedule every year, and we're asking you to update those typically, it's going to be fees like this that we're taking a look at to try to stay positive fund balance there. The environmental fee fund has actually come down slightly, and the reason for that is as part of our 2025-2026 budget, you had approved using some of that cash for emerald ash borer mitigation, and so that's what you're seeing there is us just simply starting to apply some of that cash. So you may recall we set that fee, we looked at the fee, we looked at the history, we had provided a pretty lengthy memo going into all of that, and what came of that was that we set the fee to zero. So we've kept the fee on the fee schedule. It's currently set to zero. We kind of thought mission accomplished for what we were originally collecting that money for. And we've begun to identify strategic opportunities to use that cash, such as emerald ash borers. So that's why you're seeing a little bit of a drop there. Same with housing reserve. We had advanced about $200,000 to TID number 8 for a affordable housing development. So you don't see quite $200,000 coming off there in 2024 because there's some other loans that we've had out there we're collecting revenue back from, interest income, things like that. But that's the story of the decrease there, is that we've made that $200,000 advance to incentivize some affordable housing in TID number 8. City Hall and IT funds are starting to build quite a bit of a balance there. And so the strategy that we're proposing for these funds is because these are internal service funds that charge out to all of the end users of the city, we would simply propose charging less out to those funds and essentially building a structural deficit into those funds, drawing down that fund balance a little bit, providing a little bit of a cost savings onto the other funds to try to more actively manage the balances that we have here. Ideally, your internal service funds are kind of cash in, cash out is the idea there, similar to what you're seeing with buildings. So buildings would be kind of what we'd want City Hall and IT to look like, where you're making your internal service charges, bringing money in, spending it. Because they have significant balances, we would simply propose drawing those down, again, by providing some savings on to the other funds and departments of the city. But that gives you an idea of where some of our other major funds are at. Getting into TIDs then, you can see the year that the TID was created. Well, first off, the number of the TID, the name of the TID, when it was created, and if we're forecasting a positive balance at closure right now or not. You can see that the news here is mostly good. We do have a couple TIDs, number 6, which is the Downtown Hotel, and Winfield United, which we're not currently forecasting positive balances for. So we're going to be developing some strategies over the next year to address that. What I would say there, though, is those aren't forecasted to be significant negative balances. Part of the story here is for the Winfield United parcel, it's a pretty small parcel, one parcel, one project. So there wasn't a significant amount of expense there. There's not a significant amount of increment coming in. I don't have the exact number offhand, but I know that balance we're forecasting is not a significantly negative one. But we aren't currently forecasting it to be positive.
Josh, that's the Man Valley building, not the Sterling Ponds building.
Correct.
Thank you.
And then for the Downtown Hotel, the story there is that the original developers agreement that was executed, it's probably 20 years ago at this point. It actually, for a couple of different reasons, I know that parcel's changed ownership a couple times. The developers agreement had to be amended, I think twice. And so when those amendments occurred, the developer guarantee was reduced. So it's not that this was unforeseeable. This was something that the city did to obviously work with a business that's obviously very important to our downtown. the result of that, so that was kind of the policy decision. And then the result is that, again, we're just not forecasting a positive balance for that particular TID right now. But you can see that one doesn't close till 2032. Winfield doesn't close till 2036. So we've got plenty of time to develop some strategies for those funds, and we'll be working on that over the next year. But the rest of the news there, I mean, this should be, and this is a slide that makes me feel pretty good as your finance director, but I did just want to point out a couple of things there. And then just zooming way out and looking at all funds cash, excluding bond proceeds, because bond proceeds, you borrow money, you got to use it for a very specific purpose. So if you're just kind of looking at liquidity, you can see about 10 years ago, we were at about $27.5 million. Pre-COVID, we were at 30.6. And then you can see where in 2024, we ended at about $37.8 million. So over the past 10 years, we've increased our cash position by about $10.3 million. So again, you know, the story here, and in conversations I've had with Ellers about, because we've already had some preliminary conversations about borrowing for the fire station and how are things going, what are they, you know, essentially the message they've shared with me is we should all feel pretty good about ourselves right now. They said we're in a really strong position, and this certainly highlights that from an all funds perspective. So then we kind of covered all of the CIP and the fiscal plan, and now we just wanted to review some policy questions with you to make sure we're still heading the direction that we understand fiscally you want us to be heading. So I did just want to cover some risks to all of these forecasts, because that's essentially what we're relying on when we come talk to you, is forecasts and models. And you know, they're not always perfect. We're getting the crystal ball out a little bit. So some things that could happen, obviously a national or state economic slowdown would potentially reduce shared revenues, reduce economic development activity. More of a local economic slowdown could result in some reduced net new construction, which the state uses when they tell you how much you can increase your levy by. That's the levy limit formula in a nutshell. We currently anticipate in our modeling about $100,000 to $200,000 in annual upward adjustments, and we're assuming about 1.5% net new construction there. For context, we just experienced, was it 4.4, I want to say, 4.3, 4.4. So you can see that we're outperforming that pretty significantly, but we want to be conservative in our modeling. And then any, you know, local economic impacts to our tax increment districts that could impact the transfers that we're making into our general fund. So as you all know, as we've talked about, we understand that you want us to continue incentivizing and preparing for growth because of the fact that our net new construction relies on it. We also make about $400,000 in transfers annually out of all of our TIDs into the general fund. Those transfers are baked into the project plans for all of the TIDs we're making transfers out of, and they fund essentially economic development, community development, finance, admin related activities associated with those TIDs. And so this is simply a way of saying we fund about $400,000 of our general fund budget with transfers from our tax increment district that rely on past and ongoing growth to support. So that's a risk factor. And then, of course, fewer utility customers than we anticipate. Now, we don't model any increases into our forecasts, but you know, certainly we still do act entrepreneurially with our utilities. And an example of that would be the Man Valley borrowing that we did. We had planned for several years while we're waiting for development to come online there. The debt service is obviously already owed for what we did in that corporate park. And we're advancing some funds out of our utilities to the TID to make the payments with the expectation that those utilities will be paid back in the future plus interest. So again, it's not that we're baking in any customer growths into our modeling and how we think we can make things work. It's just that we are taking advantage of strategic opportunities that we may have to talk to you about considering adjustments to in the event that there was some sort of a slowdown. And then changes to state formulas. So not necessarily associated with any economic risks, but just changes to state formulas, period, such as shared revenues or transportation aids. We get about $2.5 million in shared revenues every year, about $500,000 to $600,000 in transportation aids. So any changes there could potentially impact a fairly significant portion of our general fund revenue. And then payment for municipal services is another one. So obviously there are services we're providing to UWRF. The state is providing us what they call payment for municipal services every year. They've been chipping away at the number that we get for that. I think there have been discussions about maybe starting to increase that back up again, but it's been getting chipped away at. So those are things obviously we're paying attention to, we're watching when doing our forecasts. And then just any other emergencies or unforeseen demands on fund balance. So with all of that said, we just wanted to confirm strategies with you. Obviously success of our existing TIDs is a large contributor to our current financial results. It's a huge part of how we balance our general fund budget every year. So we've discussed risks associated with that. And, of course, I pointed out that the fiscal plan, again, is dependent on continued economic development growth. So I guess we would just want to confirm with you that, the plan is to continue to incentivize, to promote, and seek growth. We're also assuming that there is no council appetite to significantly expand services or increases to existing service levels. As a result of certain supplemental shared revenues that are tied to to services that we provide we're not seeking to adjust any of that. And then is the proposed levy allocation acceptable? And is the projected or proposed net levy increase, which right now would actually be a little less than zero. We know that the net levy target is 4. Right now it's a little less than 0. In future years, obviously we'll be trying to keep it under that 4% target. It probably won't be under 0 most years, but we've had a really high growth year from a net new construction perspective, which played a significant role in that. But just we want to confirm that 4% is still the target for net levy growth. So future steps would be we will be seeking formal approval at future council meetings for the 2026 portion of the capital improvement plan and fiscal plan, and then yet further out into the October-November timeframe, we'd be seeking council approval for the 2026 operating budget. It's the off year for the biennial budget, so it's that budget in brief document. Knowing that then next year we'll be coming back with a more robust plan for all 3 fiscal plan, CIP, and operating budget. So I'm going to turn it over to you now for questions, discussion. I think I'll just leave it on this slide of confirming council policies, and I'd be glad to jump around as needed.
I got a question. 4%, yes, that is still the target, and thank you very much for your detailed presentation. Part of your presentation that stood out to me is when you talked about paying with cash, which means the city only pays for projects' actual costs, which saves money by eliminating interest over 10 or 20 years. This preserves future borrowing capacity. This would increase money available for emergencies and high priority future projects and accommodate growth. My question for you is, did you maximize direct cash expenditures matching them with grants? And do you have a possible planning diagram where you have done that? And if you don't, could you make one potentially and send it to the council in the future?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in, and then if Scott wants to add to that. To your point about, planning diagram, we don't currently have like a formal planning diagram. I think we have an informally understood plan as staff that when we're seeking grant opportunities, yes, we are absolutely trying to, if it's a 50-50 match, we're obviously trying to keep in mind how much unassigned fund balance we have available to apply to things like 50-50 grant matches, 60-40, 80-20s. There's all kinds of different matching formulas. We're absolutely seeking opportunities to do just that. And obviously that's a big part of our work with Merchant McIntyre. There are instances where we may be adding some additional grant dollars if the opportunity presents itself to an existing project. Maybe we planned on financing a certain way. If that means we can further leverage grant dollars there, take some cash maybe we planned on applying to that project and allocating it elsewhere to take advantage of an opportunity maybe we hadn't thought we'd be able to for the next 2 to 3 years or something like that. So I think that's a long way of saying we're always seeking those types of opportunities to leverage unassigned fund balance for grants. That's part of the strategy. We don't have like a formal diagram or anything like that at this point.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. As you looked at, and I haven't seen for a while, the bonds that we currently have in place, I haven't seen whatever rates we've got. I think we've already gone through the refinance or the retirement or different things, but are there any targeted bonds, given the strong cash position we've got and the target we've given you for cash, are there any bonds out there that I know, I realize we're borrowing over here, but are there any that we should consider retiring early, or can we retire early?
So that is something that Ellers helps us take a look at every year, and they haven't. So we haven't gotten there yet this year for looking at them. As of last year, there weren't any that presented attractive enough targets to chase paying off early or anything like that.
That's what I figured. Yeah. Also, Josh, could you go back? This is way back in the beginning where you put up all the metrics for all the different. Keep going. It was keep going. That.
Yep.
Do you happen to know, I'm putting you on the spot big time. You've already answered the fund balance number, but do you have any idea where we are sitting for debt level, expenses, and all those different types of things?
We are between 40 to 45% of the state limit. So we're getting close to the council policy.
Okay.
That said, the way we've structured our anticipated borrowings relative to the debt coming off the books, for the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be hovering pretty stably in that 40 to 45% range.
Okay. Of the state.
Of the state
Of the state limit.
Yeah,
so
your policy's 50%.
All right.
And so, yeah.
So
And
state's about 100 million of equalized value. It'd be 100 million in debt for 5% equalized
yeah.
at 2 billion, and then 2.5% equalized is about 50 million. So we're in that 40 something million dollars range, which includes geo debt that's backed by revenue repayment. So we've taken the ability to use the 2.5%, which is the council's, and we've issued some GO debt for things that we could have issued revenue, but we just thought it was a better deal for the ratepayers and the taxpayers to do it.
Because we get a better rate.
Yeah, so there may be a point in time. I don't think we're projecting it anytime soon, but there may be a point in time where it might not be me or Josh, because it might be 15 years from now, but at some point that will be, we will have to be faced, well, we don't have to. It's likely that we're gonna be in a situation where it's like, we might wanna go to 2.7% or something, because we might wanna issue another $10 million of debt that's backed by the wastewater plant or something, because they're gonna get a better deal, but it'll technically exceed your debt level policy. And so the staff at the time will need to come forward and say, here's why this makes sense to do it.
Yeah.
But you kind of have those rails in, because it gets us a good idea if things are overall healthy. When you start to hit the rails, then you want to go, wait a second, what is there an indicator of something going on? But we're pretty long ways from having any difficult discussions about that. Just to follow up to Councilmember Downing's question, I mean, so the answer about grants, do we have a kind of a formal matching for cash? We don't. For overall cash, we do. And that's essentially what you're being presented is the formal plan for cash. So you see these notations throughout this plan, like, here's a place where we're going to use cash, here's a place where we're going to use cash, here's a place we're going to use cash, because we're kind of keeping a scorecard of, we know the minimum's 40, we've not come close to that. we know the target's 50, when the bobber goes up above 50, you've told us in the policy that that's exactly what you want the finance director and the administrator to do, is say, whoa, we're 53%, so we have 600,000 of cash that should be deployed, and then we go methodically, or we try to go methodically into, all right, can we retire a debt? Is there a promissory note at First National that's at 6%? That's a higher rate. Do we want to pay that off? Is there something else? Well, if we can't find a debt instrument that we think is kind of helpful for us to pay off, then we start looking at cash projects mostly, so then we start to say, well, we're going to buy this thing in the CIP, and so we apply that. And it's the same for electric, water, and sewer cash, which Josh didn't pat himself necessarily enough on the back, but I mean, if you look at the change in position there, it's pretty substantial. And that's not, that's a good amount of what that 27 million to 37 million overall cash position is frankly getting the utilities in a position where they're back in pretty good shape. And frankly, it was a policy decision by the council where you were willing to kind of ride some of that cash down for the utilities because of the economic times we were in, right? So we wanted to avoid the rate increases as long as you could because we had pretty good cash position. We knew we could ride it down, and that's what we did. Now you see that we made a rate adjustment and it rides back up. So that's a pretty good position to be in because, like Councilmember Downing pointed out, if we're using 1.6 million in capital cash for the electric utility, it's only 1.6 million to buy that. If we borrow it, it's going to be 1.8 million of finance purchasing. So this is a overall pretty good scorecard. Does that answer your questions, Councilmember?
Yeah.
On this, because I go back to that other slide so we make sure that we get the policy direction. So we heard about the 4%. We've heard is a pretty good target to stick with. Also want to confirm that the council. So we talked about levy allocation. You got 75% in operating, about 10% for library, and then you've got 15% left for debt and capital. We just want to check in and make sure that that's about what you were thinking about. And obviously, another one that's really important. The council doesn't have to say we're pro growth. Like we need, that's not this policy assumption we're trying to check here, because we are not building in aggressive growth into our assumptions. We're not assuming there's tons and tons and tons of growth, but if the council was thinking they're changing their approach to growth and they want to intentionally slow it down, or they want to somehow, if you're thinking about moratoriums on permits and things, we would want to know that now, because there is a level of growth, although pretty conservative, built into the cake here, baked into the cake. So that is what I view our check on policy at the workshop is. If you're all about in the same place you've been for a while, we're good. If there's desire to kind of slow things down or change kind of the way that we're operating on the development side, we'd want to know about that, because especially on the TID repayments, we can ride those out with not doing any more TIDs ever. It's going to really impact 2037, 2038, 2039. It's not going to impact 26, 27, 28. The cash that you've already invested in TIDs that's already performing, all those green dots you saw, those are going to pay the general fund back for a decade without much disruption. But again, those are pretty big assumptions that if you wanted to stop being in the TID game, that would change more the back end of the fiscal plan than the front end of the fiscal plan. The community is going to be able to take advantage of the success that was already determined 10 years ago. So these seem a little maybe blurry what I'm saying, but we just can kind of understand if everybody's like, yep, this sounds okay.
Scott, when you mention growth, are you talking population growth, industrial growth, manufacturing growth, commercial growth? What are you talking about?
Yes.
All of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think our approach right now is incremental but consistent growth in most categories is what we're expecting. And so we don't build a lot into anything. So we're not assuming huge population increases. We're not assuming huge industrial growth or retail demand. But there's a little of all of it in, because obviously when you're doing utility projections, you're kind of looking at the number of customers you have. And so an industrial base, the costs are probably a little bit lower overall on the service side than what you're getting in the revenue. So I would say we're looking kind of at a balanced but pretty small. We've exceeded what we put in the fiscal plan by factors of 2, 3, and 4, probably consistently for our whole time here. So does that answer your question?
Yep.
We're not like the fiscal plan isn't pinned on like all single family houses 50 a year and we got to get that many or else we're doomed, or we got to get at least $10 million of industrial growth every 3 years. We've got a little of each of it in the projections. And I think at one point when we kind of presented that to the council for the TIDs, a lot of the TIDs in the industrial, we were looking at like 3 million in new construction every 3 years. So it was like $1 million on average a year for industrial growth. Obviously the cost to put up industrial buildings has gone up significantly. And so now when you look at those project plans, and it was like Whitetail Ridge, we hope that we have 10 million total value created to make a cash flow. And then you close it with 50 million, you're in pretty good shape. And same with Sterling Ponds. The Winfield one that's referred to it, that kind of has the stoplight on it right now is I think about a $5 million total TID. So, if they put a small addition onto the place or build a lean-to, it probably puts us into the green. So that's kind of where we're at with growth. So it's still pretty conservative. We're not assuming $100 or $200 million project in order to make the fiscal plan go on any of these projects. We're not assuming even that the pace would keep up with what we've had, which I think has been over the last 10 years, probably been 50 single family units a year, probably 100 total units on average per year.
I have to ask the council, I know we all agonized over utility cost increases, but has anybody heard anybody complain about it? I've not heard one word from anybody.
I have not. No.
So see, it wasn't so bad after all.
Yeah, I mean, our relative increases were, our annualized increases, because we had waited so long to increase, were less than inflation, the regular inflation. And it probably didn't hurt too that our neighboring, utilities, especially electric, went up considerable. So we're still a very good value for what you provide. But as you know, I've got my utility bill on the whiteboard in my office. I look at it, remind myself what the end result is, right? So
I think my only comment to Mr. Bierstedt's polling question is, I continue to urge us to be loud and proud with our messaging. When everybody's all fired up about the reassessment, my taxes are going up. When we get that nailed down, we can't control the other taxing authorities. So putting out the message that this is where we're gonna be for your portion of the tax bill is good. Director Westhouse and I had a conversation last week about where we are with some of these utility increases, and we're still in the lower quartile of the rest of the state. So we got to help the public understand some perspective about where we're at and what they're getting for their dollar. And that's not always easily done, but being a little more braggadocious about some of our numbers would be a good thing.
What was the projected net levy increase that you just told us?
Right now, I don't remember off the top of my head. I just know it's a little less than 0.
Yeah.
So
to that point.
Exactly, yeah. Especially in the wake of, oh, my assessment's gone up, my taxes are gonna go up, I can't afford to, live on ramen even. The sheer panic that ensued by some people, and I think getting that message out about the mill rate and so forth. And again, we can't do anything about the other taxing authorities, they're gonna do what they're gonna do. So, but we should point out, here's where ours is.
Mhm.
I understand the other assumption we're checking is hard to do without kind of an extensive polling system of the council, but we did have the strategic plan workshop and we kind of talked about this. So we're confirming the assumption that the expectation is that we're gonna provide a good package of services, very similar to the package of services that we're currently providing with the parameters of what you're giving us for the levy. But the commitment from staff to be able to do that is that you're not going to all of a sudden determine that you need to add 5 or 6 or even one expensive new service, because we haven't built that into our assumptions. That doesn't mean you can't do that. You always have the ability to trigger that. What we'd want to tell you though is we haven't made any space in the fiscal plan for you to think about what you want to add. So if you're going to add, it means we need to delete something else. Or if you add a service, you would expect that we'd have to figure out a revenue source, either increase taxes or a fee or something to fund that. Because we think we've got a good handle on being able to continue the current level of services. And again, that doesn't have to be exactly the same package of services this year and in 3 years. It just means that we're generally gonna have about the same level of services. The council can move things here and there a little bit, but if you wanna get into some new business line or some new package of services, that's not we haven't carved out $250,000 in the operating budget for you to add a couple people and do the new project. In fact, we've only got one additional general fund position kind of baked into the cake as far as what we think the impact of growth is. So we're assuming that there is some impact of this growth in staffing just to keep those line services. We're also assuming that we have to get more efficient and effective at the service we're providing with the same amount of people that we have. So we're going to try to get more efficient and more productive with the staffing that we have. And we still think we need about one. I think we need about one. Staff department heads probably think we need more like 4 or 5, but I think we're in pretty good shape. So is that a correct understanding of where you want to be for the package of services?
Yes.
I'm good.
So that's helpful. I think that to summarize the work of Josh's presentation, we're going to spend a little less overall than we thought we'd spend. Of that little less, we're actually going to spend a little more on some operating and a little more on debt in the general fund. There's some other savings that we've had as far as transfers and other things that are going to allow that room. So that's spending is about the same as what we thought we would spend, but we have some additional revenue from new growth that we didn't necessarily anticipate. So we're allowing that to build up cash, and then we're able to spend that on projects, which kind of keeps a spiral of savings going for us, which has been a good thing. And we expect, we know we have more than 50% fund balance projected at the end of this year. So we know that there's some room for the council to use that, to apply that cash for like a fire station or something.
Talking about a fire station?
But it also means some of that cash can be used if we have an unanticipated expense at the pool, or if we have an unanticipated expense for some new variety of tree that gets a disease, or some of those things in the past we've been able to handle. And it also means we're probably going to be in a good position to present to the park board and then ultimately to the council how combining impact fees, that balances that we have, and maybe using some of the fund balance will allow you guys to make some progress on, in particular Glen Park, but maybe other projects that you choose that are important to you. So overall, good news, and, we were happy to deliver it.
Anybody else have anything for Scott?
No, thank you.
Yep, good job. Great job.
Thank you.
That's it.
So then we'll, get ready to adjourn this meeting, Mayor?
Yeah.
And then we'll reconvene for council at 6:30.